they were playing this little game where you draw cards out of this deck, and it was like prompts. And each one had a different fun question on it. So I picked one out, and it was going to be a fun, lively thing. But the question was, if you died today, what would you regret the most? And I was like, oh shit, this is really heavy. So I slid it back into the deck, and I was like, oh, no one saw. I'll just pick out another card. And then I shuffled the deck, and I pick out another card out of like 100 and get the exact same card.
Damn. Let's
Okay.
start.
All right, sorry, bad lungs. So basically, today I went to a studio. It's called the Brett Wiley Studio, and it was really interesting. It's located on 2 Rapist Street.
Rapist?
Rapist.
Raper,
Raper. Okay.
Raper, like Grim Reaper.
Reaper. That's Reaper.
No, Grim Raper.
Reaper.
No, Grim Reaper.
That's like death that rapes you before it takes your life.
Exactly, that's why it's called Grim Reaper. Anyways, in Surrey Hills, guys. So went there, and it was unbelievable. Like, just as an artist, like just a must see. Talented for a reason, because his theme of life, his theme of everything was about the sense of self and the transmutation of self.
The transmutation.
And
of
the quest for truth. That's a philosophy of his entire paintings. Like, his entire paintwork is finding that, but doing that through self-portraiture. And expressing that in different ways. But the story, without getting too much into it, is that essentially Brett Whiteley's wife is Wendy Whiteley, right? Now, she was his muse. They met at Fine Arts College, and basically she gave him a lot of inspiration, and she was also like one of a lot of his like actual physical life model, like real life models, still life models for a lot of the sculptures that he did as well. But because he was obsessed with curves, absolutely obsessed with
Did
curves.
she have a lot of curves?
I don't know about that.
She curvy
She
woman.
batty or what?
But essentially, what happened was they had a very, 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 very crazy relationship, because he had a heroin addiction.
Oh shit.
And he died.
Really?
Yeah.
Some of the best artists do, I feel.
Yeah, heroin
Wow.
addictions. Yeah, but basically, what happened was
He got her hooked.
after he died.
He's like, baby, I love you.
After he died, she was so blinded by rage, because they lived in Lavender Bay, right? So right next to her house, she was like, I'm going to clear all of this land. And she was like, every single day she would wake up and she would cut through thorns, thickets, trees. She plowed millions of dollars just clearing it. And she didn't care about council, nobody or anything, because no one had touched this land. It was just all overgrown land, which people were just like, it's okay. And she just kept clearing it. And she was like, then she had no idea about horticulture. She had no idea, but that was her way to cope with the death.
The grief?
Yeah, the grief. And then she ended up creating what is now today called Wendy's Secret Garden. And it's incredible because it is actually such a pristine place. It's called Wendy's Secret Garden by locals because not a lot of people know about it, even though it's public for viewers. But it's very, very, very just interesting. The fact that
I've been there before. It's a really like cute spot, and like it's tucked away, but you go there and you get such a beautiful view of Sydney as well.
Yeah.
Like great for like Sydney side is like great for your dates, or even just a birthday or a picnic, a nice little hang or a walk. It's a great park, and she did all of this out of love, or out of grief almost.
Out of grief, maybe both.
Yeah, probably a lot of anger as well, just hacking down trees.
Hacking down the trees.
A release.
Yeah.
But I found that connection to be quite like bizarre, because me choosing to go there was completely random. I was just kind of like, let me go check out a place that's by here. And I ended up landing on that, and I did a bit of research because I wanted to learn about the artist before I went. And looking at that, I was like, wow, this is incredible, you know?
So it's funny we kind of get onto this topic of grief. I guess something I'd been thinking about was a bit of a tangent, but somewhat related. So you guys would know like the 5 stages of grief, you know, how you start with the denial, the anger, you go through the bargaining and the depression, and then you get to the acceptance. That bargaining stage is often like, what that means is like, I wish I'd done this differently. You know, like for her case, maybe Wendy was like, oh man, I wish I'd spent more time with my guy, you know, instead of us doing our own separate art and other things. I wish we'd just spent more quality time together. And maybe that was a sadness that I was kind of carrying her through as she built this garden. But yeah, I guess something I've been thinking about more recently is just this idea of regrets. It is an expression of grief, I think. It is a stage of it. And I have a funny story about this as well. But I was at a house party yesterday, and they were playing this little game where you draw cards out of this deck, and it was like prompts. And each one had a different fun question on it. So I picked one out, and it was going to be a fun, lively thing. But the question was, if you died today, what would you regret the most? And I was like, oh shit, this is really heavy. So I slid it back into the deck, and I was like, oh, no one saw, I'll just pick out another card. And then I shuffled the deck, and I pick out another card out of like 100 and get the exact same card.
Damn.
So that's why I sent you guys this photo, because I was like, okay, something in this universe wants us to talk about this idea of regret, which is, I feel like, a universal emotion that kind of everyone feels at some point in their life in some form. But is one that you can kind of, I think, proactively change your life circumstances to kind of avoid or minimize your regrets. And when you do feel regret, there's ways to kind of, I guess, constructively deal with them too. I guess opening the floor to you guys, do you guys have any thoughts on regret as an emotion? And I guess, yeah, any thoughts there? And maybe drawing from your personal experiences, but more generally, how you think it affects people. And
Yeah, I think regret is a dangerous emotion. It's not something you can like forget about. It's also not something that just goes away after time. It's also not something that I don't know. Regret is, it's like, it's lingering. It's almost like a depression, because it's like, unless you resolve it, unless you go past into the next stage, which is acceptance, it's always going to be there. So yeah, I think regret is one of those emotions that you have to sort of process, and you have to understand why you made certain choices, and then you have to be a little bit easy on yourself as to like your own justifications, because sometimes it's not just the regret of not making a particular choice. Sometimes it's like, at the time you might actually have made the correct choice for you, but then it's just human nature to like the FOMO thing, like the fear of missing out type thing, that might be playing up a little bit, and that's feeding into your regret emotion.
It's really interesting you put it like that. So I actually did a quick Google search and a little a research. They did this study in 2018, and they kind of were, I guess, interviewing people that were about to die, and they asked them that question, like, you know, what do you regret most in life? And a common theme that emerged is that the people were expressing what was called ideal-related regrets, right? So basically, they didn't follow their dreams, or they felt like they didn't live up to their full potential. But it was kind of driven by this internal conflict that you just touched on, right? Which is, there's kind of two parts in us. There's the, and there's a word for it, I think it's called the ought self, right? And that is the part of us which is like, here's the things I should be doing. Here are my duties, my responsibilities. And these are usually how we make our decisions. What you're talking about, like, at the time, this feels like the right decision to do. For example, staying in this stable job. It's right for my family right now, right for, you know, giving myself financial stability. Seems like the right thing. There's the other side of you, which is called the ideal self. And that's to do with your hopes, your dreams, your passions. And your ideal self might say, well, I actually want to start my own business right now. I might want to go traveling, you know. Your ought self might say, you know, this is a nice girl, and on paper she's great. But your ideal self might be like, oh, but there's this other person who's like, you know, a passionate love, but that's more of a risk. I might have to move across the country, something like that, right? And there's that constant kind of battle, I guess. And I think regrets often, what this paper was suggesting, is often coming from not following that ideal self and kind of leaning in more to just your duties and responsibilities at the time, which seemed like the right action to do. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice breakdown. I completely sort of like, I think when I look back in my past in many different things, like the safer options many times that you might have chosen, those always tend to sort of be like, oh, but what if I'd done X instead at this particular point? And I'd never thought of it in the case of in like the framework of the ought and the ideal. But yeah, there is that voice in your head or that image that you have of not necessarily you doing certain things, just you as in you experiencing various things in life. Not necessarily you as in Anuraj is doing certain things, just like this body's experiencing various things. Whereas I think the ought is actually more related to you as in Anuraj for me. The ought is, okay, this is Anuraj, these are his duties, this is what he's responsible for. Whereas the ideal is it's almost it's too irresponsible. It's like it doesn't make sense, but guess what? This is what really makes sense.
Your essence, your soul or whatever is trying to drive you towards.
Yeah, it's like a fire type ideal, like everything goes well, like nothing can stop me type thing. Whereas the other one is more like restrained. Although I think over our past podcasts, I've always been the one to like call for balance on both sides. So once again, I'll still say
I agree.
Like, I don't think following one or the other is like, it's like which one at which point, or what percentage of which one across your lifetime.
Yeah.
I think if you follow ought too much across your life, you might still have a lot of regret. If you follow ideal a little bit too much, you might also will have a lot of regret.
The balance. And I think that the author of the study, that's what their conclusion was as well.
Yeah.
They were like, we don't want people to read this and start quitting their jobs and not meeting their responsibilities at the time, because that's also not the right way to live. But it's, I think, just being mindful of that balance. And regrets also, I don't think they happen overnight. It's not like you're going to turn 40 and be like, oh shit, I messed up all of these things. It's often a gradual build up. Every year, for example, you'll be staying in that job that you're not liking, but it's a small bit of incremental negativity, but it's small enough that you can just push it under the rug and just kind of not really deal with it right now. Yeah. But eventually that's going to become big enough that when you hit 40 or 50, like later in your life, it's going to become too big to ignore. And that's when the grief really begins. Yeah. And actually, maybe a question for you, Dylan, like, and this is kind of going into, I guess, our personal lives a bit more, but I know like you're someone who was working in, say, the corporate world, and that was, you're following your ought duties and, following your degree and your academic background, stable financial job, and then kind of leaving that for kind of pursuing your passions, right? Going to the complete unknown and probably having some imposter syndrome of, can I even make it? And kind of really leaning into that ideal self. Do you feel like there was an element of thinking you don't want to have any regrets, and that's why you took that leap? Did that kind of factor into your transition in that respect?
So I think what happened for me was, at a certain point, after day, you kind of realized what the value of each decision meant, in the sense of how much I was giving up. And I think I kind of epitomized it like an hourglass with sand falling down. And I think I saw it like that, where I thought eventually there will be a time where there will be no more sand. And when that day does happen, I won't have the option to think, why didn't I do this? Especially when that thought was such a strong, persistent one in my mind. And that's where I think people should actually pay attention to those thoughts. Because those are thoughts that require action on that situation. Yeah. For me, I realized that was probably a function of a decision that I'd done before. For example, like, I enjoyed working with numbers, I enjoyed finance, but could I honestly say that my heart was in finance from the day that I studied it, or I studied as a major? No. Which would probably lean into the concept of, like, lean into what your responsibilities are, what could create this version of you that would be safe in that sense, or would create that net, but I kind of realized that I was at my ends to the point where I didn't want to actually essentially work in any function or any capacity that would hinder my creativity at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I was so completely burnt out, and I felt like I had that decision to make, which was essentially, do I stake everything that I have based off a reputation that I want to earn for working for someone else,
Mm-hmm.
or do I stake it to do something where I can potentially create something that I can create, irrespective of whether I know what I am going to create?
Mm.
And that's where I kind of realized that
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, I have to be the one that has to capitalize upon opportunity, and I can't blame anyone for that. I think that was the stepping stone, and I think a lot of other events before that kind of pushed me to realize that at the end of the day, the only person that can ultimately choose that and choose what the outcome is will be me.
Mm.
Like, the outcome being one in which that you don't really like there isn't so much discordance between yourself, your ideal self, and the self that is there. Because like I just didn't want to be in that position where like I didn't even know who I was. And I think when you're young, especially when anyone is young, it's a paramount responsibility to understand who you are before you commit to anything big in life, because that will give you so much of an edge to understand what you can provide to whatever you do, whether it be business, marriage, whether it be any job, anything that you do. Understanding yourself is the most critical thing.
Mm.
So without a doubt, I always say that to make the most rash decision is the wisest thing to do, even if that was so counterintuitive to everything that I learned, and it was the only thing that made sense, and it was the only way to go. And I feel like it was a thought that wasn't really probably ordained by me in some sense, like it wouldn't have come about had I not gone through that.
Mm.
So in some ways I am grateful for that, but
So as a follow-up question, I think everything that you said there was really nicely put. But as a follow-up question, for those who might be struggling to understand themselves, what exactly is the process of doing that? And when you say, okay, now I understand myself, what is the state of mind, what is the state of body that you feel when you're secure in your own identity, self-created identity?
I think it becomes that there is no differentiation between the identity you represent versus the identity you create. Like they sync, because you've essentially destroyed the ego, not just the ego, but you've destroyed the outward appearance to what is. And there is an insecurity in that appearance. You keep the maintenance of trying to keep yourself up to make yourself look a certain way, to do a certain thing for a certain person, for that identity. And I think it's kind of destroying that to come back to who you truly are, but to have calm with that, and to then to be able to perhaps even build up a new one. And the new one is founded on the foundation of who you truly are. So essentially, the way that I think about it is, to find confidence in yourself, you must destroy the old version of you to be able to understand yourself, to create something new. It's a process of creation and destruction. But a lot of us get really lost in the destruction part, because once we've created, we forget to destroy, or we get attached to the creation as opposed to relishing in the destruction, because there is a beauty in both. And I think that's the most important part to being able to develop that confidence in understanding that if you can stand up after you have destroyed, then you will be able to stand up the next time you destroy. You will be able to stand up the next time that you think about what you do. Like there is never, it's never like I know what my next creation will be. It will be, I know that I can, like my legs will support me if I fall again, because I have fallen once. And if I fall again, then I know that at least when I fall, it won't be as hard as it was before. And that in effect then creates depth to the words that you then deliver. And I think that's the most important thing, is that you start then you start then understanding what you're really saying, and the words that you're saying start to become an extension of yourself. You don't think about the words that you say. You don't think so deeply about it, because the synthesis is occurring without you like realizing it, and the everything else works in accordance to it. So yeah, I think I've lost track of your first question.
I think to your question, I think we're kind of going back to what's kind of, I felt, been one of the fundamental questions around our podcast, even last few episodes, which is this idea of finding your why, and then the what kind of falls into place. And I think that's what you're touching on here. Like in this process of kind of self-discovery, you kind of are understanding, well, what are the values that I stand for? What are the passions and hobbies, interests, all these things I have? And this is like what the ideal state we just talked about was in that framework. It's very easy to figure out your ought self, right? Like that's just material Anuraj or Dylan or Chet. The responsibilities and duties I have, that's very easy. But the other side, the ideal self, is much harder to figure out.
Yeah, I find that you're right in that sense, but I find the ought is much harder to fulfill. The other one is difficult to find out, and then obviously you have to make a few big decisions to like destroy what you had created and then rebuild in a different lane. However, the ought is quite related to what we talked about in our previous podcast, which relates a lot to discipline and like security and building that like foundation of being able to create the type of person who has the legs that can take the destruction that you like will inevitably bring forth.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we're going back to the same idea of you need both. You need that balance of both. And I feel like what happens when you don't have that balance, for example, in the example Dylan was just talking about, if someone doesn't have that why, if someone doesn't have, you know, what they stand for, what it is that they want to do with their life, you're just going to end up leaning more into the ought self and just being like, well, what do others expect of me? What is needed of me? And I'll just do that. Right. And then you neglect, you know, living a life where you're true to yourself, rather than you end up living the life that other people want of you. And I think that is a common regret. So, and this kind of leads also, this book that I briefly skimmed, very, very briefly, but it's on this topic. I'm circling back to the regrets thing, but the person who worked, it was like a nurse who worked in palliative care for like their whole life. They talked about some of the most common regrets they would hear from people who were like terminally ill or like, you know, pretty much close to the end of their life. One of them is the one that you just touched on, Dylan, which is like people that, you know, didn't figure out what they wanted in life and then just ended up living for others. Like that was one of the most common ones. Another one that came up was like wishing that they hadn't worked so hard in their life. I think this is again to that balance point we've been talking about, like when you overweight your career in your life and then that leads you to neglecting other areas. And there's actually a LinkedIn post I saw just today, which I think kind of touches it connects to this nicely, but it was this quote that in 20 years from now, the only people who remember that you worked all those late nights, you know, it's probably not your coworkers and your bosses, but it will be your family and your children. Yeah. Right? They'll be the ones who will be like, the memory of you will be just kind of working late constantly. Right? And I think that is a very common regret. And as people, especially our age, I feel like it's something we just need to be mindful of. I think like coming back to this question, how can you like stop these regrets from occurring, right? Part of it is, well, right now you have that control over your life and how you were thinking, you know, there's a finite time you're going to have in your life, finite energy, the hourglass sort of thing. Almost thinking like, okay, well, when I'm 80 and looking back, I don't want to have a life of regret. So what should that life look like from now, projecting forward?
But like, to interject, I think it's futile to think of a life without regret. It's just pointless. It doesn't make any sense because regret will occur regardless whatever decision you make.
Yes.
Like you make a big decision, you will always constantly think of whether that was the right decision to make.
Yeah.
And so like it's great. Like I think as well, like from like to play devil's advocate, and I think it's great. Like when we think about like the concept of like we shouldn't have worked as hard, because I know so many instances of so many people close to me that have worked so hard, but still you can see it from a third perspective. It's like, why do you do this? Why do you work as hard? Like you should clearly take a step back. But like I think regret is one of the greatest lessons that a person can learn from. And I think you can't minimize that in any way or form, because it minimizes the ability for a person to learn.
No, I agree. I'm 100% with you in that point. The way, touching back to Anuraj's earlier point, I still think regret is somewhat of a dangerous or negative emotion. Like all grief, it hinders us in many ways. But with that said, if you have regret for either something you did or didn't do, I think it can still be used as a learning and growing opportunity. But I still feel like in the first instance, you should be trying to minimize it before it occurs. But when it has occurred, you can use it constructively, which is, I think, what you're saying.
I agree. I think that's where Dylan's point of using regret as a learning tool to redirect whatever is causing you that regret, to redirect whatever decisions that you might have made, you accept them, and then you ask yourself, okay, from this point onwards, what exactly do I want, which will minimize further ongoing regret in this arena.
Yes.
And yeah, to some extent, I don't think any emotion that we have is unnecessary. I think all the emotions that we have are like trying to tell us something. It's our body trying to tell us something.
Absolutely.
Maybe we're addicted to dopamine highs or whatever it is. Like we're constantly trying to get there. Sometimes I wake up and I'm just like, wait, why exactly do I have to wake up and go to work and do basically anything? Why do I have to why do I even have to eat? Like I can't be bothered eating. I can't be bothered. And it's not in a very negative way, and it's in a very dispassionate towards life way. Like, what am I doing here?
But it's a good kind of almost critical thinking voice of like just challenging your assumptions.
Exactly.
Right?
Why am I eating this food? Do I care about this particular plate that I have? Like, why does this plate exist?
Would you count that as regret though? That sounds more just like...
Yeah, but like I'm saying this from the perspective more of like various emotions trying to tell us different things. So yeah. I also forgot where exactly I was going with that.
No.
Just to add to that, I think what is worse than regret is not learning to actually listen to what regret is telling you. Because one, I don't think regret is I don't personally think regret is a negative emotion, because I don't think anything is either inherently positive or negative. It's just a frame of perspective. So I believe in when you deal with a particular emotion, regret is a function of you being able to understand, okay, what has happened here, right? But what is perhaps slightly negative, or how you could look at it in a way, is if you tune out that regret such that you perhaps masquerade that regret with doing something else, as opposed to actually feeling what that regret is telling you, feeling what it's like, actually hearing what you want to say. Because majority...
Hello, how are you? I am under the water. Please help me. Here too much raining.
Three, two, one. And welcome back to The Outline with Dylan, Chet, and Anuraj. We were talking about regret, and Dylan had a quote that he wanted us to ponder upon.
All right. So, this was continuing on the Brett Whiteley theme, because I'm fucking fangirling right now.
Regret Whiteley?
You make me wet, Whiteley. What?
I don't have one to follow that. Fuck. I'll think of it. All right. So, one of the hardest things is to discipline oneself to keep looking until one sees to a point of almost insistent madness, to concentrate on one vision until it discloses its third or fourth veil, To keep seeing past what you have just seen requires feeling and ambition. Eventually, a natural, uncomplicated, real glimpse appears, and that's what one is after.
Damn.
Yep. I think when you were saying that quote, for some reason, I had a thought which, when you were talking about constant discipline or like just to keep looking constantly, for some reason, I had a view, or like just basically I had like a view in my head, which was not related to the topic too much, was more related to just environment, and not like the natural environment. It's just the environment in which you exist. So, for example, what is your work environment like? What is your home environment like? And who are the people around you? Because it's sometimes, I find, really hard to constantly be in your preferred flow state if the people around you are not sort of like aligned to that preferred flow state as well. Like if you're constantly like in your own, if you in your own head have a preferred flow state and like it's good, but then someone else sort of comes and they're always around you, but their worldview and what they want from you is very, very different. It's hard to hit that constant mark of what Brett Whiteley was talking about, because it creates discrete like stops in your flow, basically. And yeah, like
I think to me it was more around what you introduced it earlier, around how his work is more around the quest for kind of uncovering oneself and the calling in life. It links back to what we've been, I guess, talking about earlier, with your ideal self, and I'm going to try and link this, I guess, to also what we ended up before the intermission. We were talking about in the second half, we're going to talk about how do you curb having regrets, and how do you, when you do have regrets, how do you deal with them? Like, what are the practical kind of ways to actually go about it? And what we identified, step one, is kind of, well, first, to avoid having the regrets, you need to actually understand, well, what is your ideal self? What is your sense of self? What is it that you want outside of just your duties and responsibilities and things you have to do? Look after the people in your life. What is it that you want to get out of this life that if you don't get, that you will regret? And I think that's kind of partly what Brett is talking about, is part of that actually requires a level of discipline to kind of keep chipping away at that process, to kind of keep uncovering what it is that you want. It's not a one day thing that you just figure out. It is a journey.
Yeah.
To kind of uncover that.
That's beautiful. I think I agree with that, and I think that makes me also, I think my interpretation of that lines with both of yours. But I think what I would say is that regret is essentially a function of the process that we've already discussed about, but it's also a function of the chaos. And I think if it is a function of the chaos, then you must see through to it that the end result will be something simple, like he said. Because eventually, like, chaos, if enough pressure is applied, if there is just, if it is simplified to what it is, then there can be something simple extracted from it. And I think that's what I think is really interesting, is like when we think of regret as well, like for example, like a bad breakup, right? Regret for staying so long. Okay, great. Let's experience this emotion of going through this feeling and go through it. But on the other hand, thinking that like, okay, well, why did I go through this thing? Like I went through this breakup. I feel this way. I feel so much regret, and now I want to see to the end that like I can understand, I don't want to be devoid through all of that chaos. And I think that's what's really interesting, is that regret is one of the layers of deception that I would say, in that sense. It's like, you must destroy that layer, that veil, to get to the final point, which is full clarity, full wisdom of being able to see what it is as it is, which is the truth of what the matter was, which was whatever it was for that relationship, for that business, for that job, for whatever it is. But until you have shed that stage, until you have shed that veil, you ultimately are not able to understand what it is because you're still embedded behind what that layer is showing you. And that's what I kind of interpreted it as being, you know, that essentially chaos has many layers of deception. Chaos in itself, like if we use Hindu mythology, you know, Shiva is the chaos destroyer. So he must destroy every single apparition of chaos till he understands what to become one with truth, right? And I think that's what it is that the truth is so simple, so uncomplicated, so natural, and something that we can innately understand. But when it is only until we go through each stage fully and experience it fully in what it is to be able to then say, okay, now I understand what is and how it is, and now I can move on, now I can create, now I can develop.
Yeah, I think what you just kind of touched on, it kind of reminds me of a conversation I had today where I was asking a lot of the friends I have, like, what is the biggest, if you died today, what regret would you have? What's the biggest regret you'd have? One of my friends said an answer where, like, they said maybe the cliche answer they could give me is like they dated someone for like 10 years and then they broke up, and you know, an easy answer would just be that they regret dating this person for so long and it took up so much of their life. But that wasn't their answer, because they said that they learned so much from that and it made them the person they are today, that if anything they feel grateful for it. And that's kind of how you're describing it, is when you're able to kind of get through that feeling of grief and the negativity towards it, which is that regret, you can kind of start to appreciate it in the bigger picture sense of what did you actually gain from it as well. Like the good that it kind of gave you. I think every experience, like you said, there isn't objectively good or bad, but it can be whatever you want it to be. But when you're overcome with this feeling of grief and regret, it prevents you from being able to see the good. What do you think?
I completely concur. I think, I just completely concur. Yeah. There's not much to add there, honestly.
Yeah.
I think what I realized is that with the truth, it's neither good nor bad, right?
Yeah, it just is.
It just is, right? And I think that's one thing we need to always evaluate as people whenever we're feeling whatever we're feeling. Feel the feeling, but also understand that what you're feeling is perhaps just one side of the coin.
Yeah, and a lot of the things with regret is whatever decision that you're maybe wanting to make or not making, or maybe one that you already have made that you shouldn't have made. The reason that you didn't make it soon enough was because that feeling that you had that was telling you should make it actually genuinely went away. Like, new information came and that feeling went away, and then it maybe came back, and then it went away, and then it came back. And that's why I was talking earlier on in the episode a lot about, like, you got to be very honest with yourself about, like, oh, I was stupid, or I should have made this earlier. That's not necessarily true, because whatever feeling you have, feelings also have like a timeline. They come and go, and various different things will, you know, add a few coins into the deposit box of a feeling, and then take a few away from some other ones. So, like, when you're talking about, like, oh, I shouldn't have been in that relationship for 10 years for something, it's like, I think that relationship was the right relationship for you for those 10 years. And then you decided that, okay, maybe you guys are just not aligning as much as you would like to. And at the end of the day, you just want to spend time with people, and you want to spend your life in a way that you just enjoy living. And if you can't do that with the person that's the closest to you, I don't think it's negative. It's not a bad thing. It's just that it's unfortunate, maybe, because, like, loss is unfortunate.
I feel like, so you guys both have touched on this. So there's this element of unfortunate or luck, and how you described it as chaos. I feel like regret often stems from things in the past that have occurred due to our own decisions.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to regret that the GFC happened. That wasn't me.
No.
But it's like, but the actions I did is what I'm going to regret. So I feel like when in this conversation, we need to be like, I think, mindful of like, what is my span of control? What is it that I can exert control over and influence? And generally, I feel like those are the things we are likely to have regrets about, if anything, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
in the context, I guess, of this relationship, like there's an element of it didn't work out. I think the reason why people have regrets is like, oh, you know, there was a little voice in me that was saying that it wasn't right, but I ignored it and I kind of just stuck to it because, you know, everyone else said it was good, but I should have listened to it, and that's the regret. And the grief, really, if you just think about it, it comes back to the hourglass you talked about, right? Our life
it's
is
a
finite.
time.
It's the time. And when I keep saying grief, we're grieving time. That is the true thing that is lost. If we were immortal beings, we wouldn't really feel sad. We can just keep going, have new relationships, just infinite, like, more adventures, but we can't, right? We only have a finite amount of time and energy in this life. And I feel like that's where all of these regrets are coming from. It's like, oh, in this time that was lost, or the time was lost because I didn't either, you know, do something because I was held back for XYZ and now I can't do it anymore. Or I did do something and that was also not the optimum thing to do. You know, I wasn't in the right balance with my ideal and ought self. So it's kind of a hindsight thing of, you know, if I had that time back, I would do this differently.
Yep.
But
Interesting.
No,
yeah,
I agree
yeah.
with you there. I think it's the time lost that you're genuinely grieving. It's like, oh, well, if I had listened then I wouldn't have felt this now again. But it also goes back to what you were saying there in the middle, where you do have to introduce like gratitude from time to time, because like, okay, you did feel that, but you did your best to, you know, accept that feeling, and you poured more into whatever it is that you maybe shouldn't have poured into. And that built a kind of character that you can say that was like good.
Yeah.
And you can be grateful for like many of the coping mechanisms that you like develop.
Yeah.
If they're not harming you, then
things you're taking for granted that you have developed, but like you wouldn't have otherwise.
Developed. Yeah, like
but
hardship.
It's hard to say that, right?
Because hardship is what builds growth, and so
we can
like,
kind of imagine other trajectories, and being like, oh, if I hadn't been with this person, I could have been doing X, Y, Z.
Yeah,
here's the things I would have not had, but you also don't see the things you wouldn't
already
have had.
do have.
That you do have
you
now
did
that you
have,
wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah,
like it's like the grass being greener situation. There's a bit of like hindsight, I guess, bias here, and
and I think the ideal self is quite prone to, I guess, changing the ideal quite often. Because it's so like chaotic in a sense. So the ought self is what brings it, like, you ought to see the gratitude in things because that's actually true. The ideal doesn't yet exist until you make it true.
Yes.
And you make it true through the ought self. You ought to do the things you must do so that the ideal can be achieved, type thing. I think like ever since I've met you, Chet, I think you've talked a lot about gratitude various times across, I guess, like the 6-7 months that we've been closer. And I actually like take that example quite often, and it's been it's been really helpful in my life as well. So gratitude is quite important. On those days where I'm just like, oh, what am I doing? Why am I alive? Who cares? Yeah. Who cares? Like, just do the thing that you have to do. Enjoy it. There's like a little bit. There's a little bit of like, okay, coding overall is boring, but the fact that I solved this problem, kind of fun. Yeah. I think that's actually a really good suggestion, because we're talking kind of solutions. At this point, and gratitude is almost like the opposite of regret. You know, you're kind of looking at the time that's gone and the experiences you've had, and rather thinking of like the negatives, or, you know, things I wish I'd done differently, you're like, well, this happened, and these are things I'm so glad happened. And the positives of them. Right. So I think even practicing gratitude every day can help curb that regret, kind of by just shifting your perspective. Right. That's what this has been about. It's just like seeing the truth from a different perspective. It's like an antidote in some sense. It is. I think practicing gratuity gets us in touch with ourselves, and gets us in touch as well with who we become, and builds that confidence in ourselves. And I think it's so important that like every day you do something like that, where you remind yourself, oh, I'm grateful for this, because, you know, if you do, sorry guys,
if you do lose, sorry, if you do if you do lose that, then you really want to essentially accelerate your ability to see the truth faster, because you've already come to understanding. This is what it is.
Yeah, I agree. And I think to practice gratitude, you have to draw a certain level of awareness, right? You just have to reflect and think and feel and really draw attention to your experience. And I think that alone is step one, because when you, I think, train that muscle, you're going to see the gratitude. But I think almost the same muscle we talked about earlier is like, you know, regrets form through a lot of these little negative feelings that are coming up that kind of grow and grow. But the same way you can see the little good, I feel like the same muscle can see the little bad. You know, you just become more aware and mindful of those sides as well, and are able to take action on them before they're this giant thing that is just insurmountable.
Yeah.
Right.
I think what you just said goes back to what we talked about in our second episode, maybe. And maybe we shouldn't do cross pollination like that, but we talked a lot about like repeating patterns. And so if you're constantly looking at the negatives, you're training yourself to look at the negatives. And if you look for gratitude, you're training yourself to look for positives.
Absolutely.
Gratitude has the power to, like, if you have a giant black cloud, it has the power to just bring the sun out quite quickly. It makes a situation more just simple. Like if you have it simplifies a lot of things, and like it takes your like issues away. All the little things, like all like the big burdens, all the stress that you might have, they fizzle out, but like not from the perspective of it. They fizzle out from the perspective of how insignificant they actually are in the grand scheme of things.
You don't let them like mentally weigh you down,
exactly,
and stopping you from kind of taking action and kind of moving forward.
Yeah, do the thing that's in front of you. Yeah,
I think it's also a thing where I've noticed that generally when things have been absolutely chaotic, it's always been the grounding principle of making me resituate myself to where I actually am. Because it's like in chaos you lose everything, right? There is no concept of where you are, what you are, and what's happening. It is just what it is, right? But gratitude brings you down. It's like, okay, I have parents, I have a partner, I have a job, I have XYZ. Okay, look at all these things. Look at the tangible things that exist. Look at all these real things that exist. Okay, now you can start to realize, oh wow, like I actually do have it. Oh, okay, look, where am I? Like you start to open your eyes. You start to realize, okay, like there is actually something to look forward to. And I think it's so important that like we then start to realize how to realign our focus to what matters. And I think that's...
I completely agree. Like what you said there, like gratitude is like a stepping stone to it. Like, you know how in Avatar you have Avatar the Last Airbender, you've got those 8 ponds and the chakras that he's talking about. Like but I'm not taking this from into the chakras direction, but like when he removes that little weed that's been stuck between 2 ponds, gratitude is like that. It's like it opens up an avenue for you to redirect your negative emotion. And so when you realize that, okay, so I have a wonderful partner, I have parents, I have friends, I have hobbies, all those things. Those things, once you identify them, once you feel grateful towards them, that's where you direct your negative emotion. And it's not in a like you like, I guess, impose your negative emotion on them, but you sort of interact with them such that you can find yourself a little bit more. So maybe if you're feeling regretful and you have the hobby of photography, take that anger out and just go take some photos because you're grateful that you actually have a camera that can do that, for example. And in that, you will find the next step.
Yeah, I have I guess maybe similar. I think where I was going to go with it was something where similar to where you landed, but through a different path. So
yeah,
I guess for me, gratitude, I think it can, by like kind of appreciating the little things in life, right? You're constantly trying to find what is going to make me happy, right? It kind of goes back to this point we talked about before about finding your why, finding your passions, your, you know, the real big kind of dreams and things that you have, your ideal self. I feel like gratitude is doing that on a small scale, you know, not like the passions and your high level wise, like, you know, I want to do X in the world or create X or blah. And that's the thing that will give you the highest level of fulfillment and happiness. Right. But practicing gratitude is you doing that on a smaller scale and kind of training yourself to do that so that when those actual things come by, your hobbies or whatever, you know, you'll practice a little bit of gratitude towards that, and you get your return on investment will be heaps, and you'll be like, oh, that's where I need to keep looking. You know, it's just a way to kind of identify, you know, what the kind of person you want to be, the way you want to grow into.
Yeah.
And coming back to this conversation about regret, if you're already practicing that now, being able to, you know, understand how you want to grow and what your, you know, passions are now, you're more likely to be able to actually change your life to align with that early, rather than you realizing 60 years later that, oh, I actually really enjoyed rock climbing and I'm realizing this now, rather than back then when I really enjoyed when I did it, but I just wasn't, you know, aware of it and mindfully there that, man, I'm, you know, I can do this.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, sometimes you do something and you really enjoy it, but remember earlier I talked about getting sedated really quickly, and so you're not really focusing on what your emotional system, your nervous system is telling you, and so you didn't recognize the fact that you actually really enjoyed this, and so you never went back to it because you became sedated really quickly. You were doing it, but you were doing it with very little awareness.
Yeah.
So for anyone that's listening out there, how, for someone who probably maybe has never practiced gratuity or doesn't know how to practice gratuity.
Gratuity, the same as gratitude. I
No,
thought gratuity was like
paying
tips.
sorry.
Is that even a word?
Bagger doesn't leave tips at restaurants.
Gratefulness.
We don't do that. We don't do that in Australia, bro.
Let's say gratefulness. Sorry.
Gratitude. Yeah.
Gratitude. Yeah, let's say gratitude.
Gratuity.
Gratuity feels like, yeah.
Feels
anyways.
posh. It does.
Feels
I'll
posh,
give it
yeah.
to you. It feels
Yeah.
posh. Yeah.
For anyone that hasn't practiced gratitude and is trying to look for another alternative to deal with situations in life or life in general, how do we kind of suggest a practical way to kind of look for a start? How do we start being grateful?
I have a suggestion on this. One thing, so I've tried practicing gratitude in a few different ways. The classic one people suggest is gratitude journaling, where it's at some point in the day you write down 3 things you're grateful for. I tried that. Often it leads to kind of being the same 3 things, grateful for the nice, country I'm living in, and the clean air, my family, and then something else about me and my health or something, right? I find it instead with gratitude, it's most effective when you're specific, and for example, the way I've been doing it recently is more at the end of the day, I ask myself the question, what went well today? Right? With that specific question, and I have to find 3 things to answer that. Right? And it has to be specific to that day. It can't be as general and abstract. And that makes you kind of look through that chaos and try to find the good that has happened to it. And also those moments of the aha and, my heart was on fire in those moments as well. Helping you uncover those, the ideal self as well in the process. That's my suggestion. I don't know if you said you've been trying some gratitude practicing. Any suggestions?
Yeah, I agree with you. I tried gratitude journaling as well. Wasn't really for me. I was looking for things to be grateful for.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you keep it in mind that gratitude is something that you want to have, you will find moments throughout the day. You will feel it. It's like, oh wow, that's pretty cool. And just take a moment to appreciate that. That's what I do usually. I don't have a direct practice where I ask myself a particular question. I generally just go through the day and appreciate. Whenever I appreciate something, I remember that gratitude is something that I'm trying to practice, and then it sort of registers. It aligns. My brain just does it.
Yeah. No, I think that's just as effective, rather than in retrospect, kind of reflecting back, just in the moment. We are sitting here right now, and I'm so grateful that we're having conversations about things that I'm super passionate about in a way that maybe other people can hear about it too, and just being able to spend time with some of my best friends. I'm grateful for this moment, and you can do that with every moment of your life. Just take a breath and just just look around and be happy.
Yeah. And gratitude also has the power of shifting your own mood. Before the halftime, we were talking a lot about regret, and my mood was quite like, just internally, we were talking about discussing it. It was quite negative. But ever since we started talking about gratitude, I don't know
just
about
the
you
word
guys.
itself, yeah.
Just like maybe our energy has shifted a little bit. We're like laughing a little bit more. We're teasing a little bit more. I think it brings in positivity in the moment as soon as you like sort of appreciate it. So that's probably a good reason of why you should do it.
And maybe on that note, we might wrap up the episode. I think Anuraj is going to take us away.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Outline with Dylan, Chet, and Anuraj. Still deciding on the name. I think this episode was really nice. We discussed some very deep topics. We asked, what if you had to die today, what is something that you would regret? From there, we really deep dived into regret and what it really was and how you can identify it. And then what are some ways to tackle regret? And one of the most pressing and most important ways we found was through practicing gratitude. And if anyone's listening, I think every human at some point will have any of these questions that they'd have to answer themselves anyway. It has a lot to do with personal self, what you align to, where you're going, where you see yourself going. And sometimes, like, I used to be the type of person that didn't like small talk, but now I love small talk. I think small talk's great because a lot of the times when you ponder these deep questions a little bit too much, you're missing out on the little things. And I think the little things is what makes life worth living. And that's where I think gratitude comes in the most.
Very well put.
The little things. Yeah.
Name of the podcast. The little things.
The little things.
The little big things.
The little big things. I like it. Big things, little things.
From maybe that should be our outro song. From little things, big things grow.
We're gonna do this super like. All right. We'll see you guys next time.
See you guys next time.